My personal reason for an event like this is really not about myself or my neighbors. I do this for my daughter, and I guess that's a big part of it, which is the blonde girl that's running around here, and all of your kids and grandkids. I think most of us will survive this, but it's to give the next generation the opportunity to live the life and have the land that we have.
Call a physical invasion, and it just is what it is. If the government, either by itself or if the government authorizes a physical invasion of your property, it's a taking. And why they say that is, as a property owner, you have a certain number of rights in your property, and we call it the bundle of sticks, and some of the other speakers will get into this. But what everybody agrees on in terms of property rights and property laws, that the most important stick in that bundle is the right to exclude. What is property ownership if it's not the right to tell someone else to get off? And that's the point, is that it has always been the most important right associated with property ownership is the right to tell someone else to get off your property. The right to tell someone else you don't want that happening on your property, and the right to control who's on your property, who's not on your property, and what happens on your property. And so what the U.S. Supreme Court has said is that, yes, there are issues, or there are times where you're in a regulatory takings analysis because it's not a situation where the government is openly trying to take property, it's just that the government is regulating property. And so what the state of North Dakota was trying to say with Senate Bill 2344 is, hey, we're just regulating the use of property for oil and gas development. And I mean, technically those words aren't untrue, they sure are, but they are, what they're doing is authorizing the entirety of the oil and gas industry for any operations under Chapter 3808. They're authorizing them to physically use your land to do that, whether it's the pore space or whatever it is. But because it's an authorization for that physical access, whether it's pumping produced water into the pore space or pumping CO2 down there, the idea that the government is saying someone else can physically invade your land is what we call a categorical taking. And so that's the argument that we've made in our briefs. And that's also the argument that we won with at the district court level. So,
a pore space agreement, as well as preserving future opportunities for other uses, both on the surface and in the subsurface. So one of the considerations sort of that would apply to every pore space owner, because pore space is part of the surface and it can't be severed, right, is what access are you granting? Are you granting an injection right only, or are you also granting rights to certain sort of surface access? And by surface there, I mean the above ground surface. That could include compressor stations, it could include injection wells, it could include seismic necessary for reservoir characterization, it could include compressor stations and pipelines. And so what kind of rights are being given with that pore space? Is it the right to store CO2? Or is it also the right to build roads and other sort of associated industrial facilities that would go with these types of projects?
A lot as well. Why have you not signed? And I'm going to put in quotation marks yet. We're not opposing the project that's in our area by any means, but we weren't necessarily interested in the lease agreement that was put in front of us. I have a background in business contracts. When I read the contract, I said, what's interesting, this contract isn't necessarily what I would advise our family to sign, and we sought legal advice on that as well. But we did then take the initiative to move forward and get some advice on it. So some of the reasons that initially when we looked at the first form of the lease, there really was a general lack of protection for surface use rights. So landowner rights, what you get to have control over on your land, because the pore space leases generally want not just your pore space, but they want your surface as well. And so we have concerns about, well, how does that affect our surface? What are those developments on our surface going to look like, and how does it affect the continuing use and enjoyment of our land? And the way we read the initial lease agreement was it gave the sequestration company essentially a carte blanche. They could put anything, anywhere, pay you any amount they want to use your surface, and if you don't like it, you get to take them to court. And so that was how we interpreted the initial lease agreement. Also in that initial lease agreement, there was very little teeth, I would say, in the lease to hold the sequestration company accountable for their performance of their contract obligations. We also saw that there was either very limited or in some cases absent any insurance requirements for the sequestration company to come onto our land, and not just to do the injection of the CO2 into our pore space, but access for our surface as well. And as many of you landowners out there, you get concerned when people come onto your land, and you want to make sure that they have insurance to be on your land. And when we did a financial analysis of the lease agreement, what really stood out to us were two key points. One was we saw that the sequestration company was going to be rewarded significantly disproportionately to the landowner, and that the landowner reward was very highly back-end weighted in the lease term versus early on when the sequestration company was being rewarded mostly.
One of the big problems with asset retirement is the lack of transparency on how much it actually costs to fulfill the obligation. So in my opinion, one of the most important recent events comes straight out of North Dakota, and it's an issue the Northwest Landowners Association has done some great work on, and that's their analysis of the Bakken Restart Task Force. I can't top what this organization has done with respect to that program, but what I can say is that one of the great outcomes has been the actual invoiced plugging and reclamation cost data that has emerged. So I don't know if you all have seen those numbers. The average cost per site decommissioned with CARES Act funds in North Dakota was around $280,000 for plugging and reclamation combined, much higher than what regulators were quoting as expected costs just a year or two ago, and more than 5 times greater than North Dakota's base bond amount for a single well. Now remember, if you have 2 or more wells, you can put it on a $100,000 blanket bond, and the more wells you have, the lower the actual collateral level for your whole portfolio. It's interesting, I didn't know much about wind turbines, but I guess they ask for full collateral from wind turbines, but when it comes to oil and gas, on average, about 1 to 2% collateral. Asset retirement obligation, or ARO for short, is the term used under U.S. accounting principles to describe the cost to perform legally required decommissioning and reclamation services at the end of an asset's useful economic life. In other words, after a borehole is drilled and the reserves are depleted, the operator is required by law to plug it, and if the company is publicly traded, they're required to disclose what those costs are in their ARO accounts. AROs are recorded as additions to corporate debt on the balance sheet. They are debt-like obligations, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Presently, disclosure practices across the industry, I feel like I'm super loud. Am I too loud, or is this good? Is it good? Okay. Disclosure practices across the industry are almost never provide all the information necessary to clearly assess and track how well companies are managing asset retirement. And reported AROs often, if not always, substantially understate what the actual expected costs will be. I won't get into the details on the slide of disclosure issues, but if you want to talk about it at the end or afterwards, please, I'm happy to go through this in more depth. But suffice it to say, disclosures are ineffective, and privately owned companies are not required to make any public ARO disclosures. So landowners and the public are generally left without the information needed to clearly assess who is and who is not taking care of business in a responsible manner. Go to the next slide. In general, though, and I'll cover this in a lot of detail today, no one really is, at least not proactively. Companies are not obligated to set aside funds to settle asset retirement obligations, so they do not do it. Instead, they pay for plugging out of operating cash flow, and generally only as required by regulations or as necessary to prevent loss of well control and other costly issues that may arise when fracking in a crowded field. Because asset retirement costs, by definition, come due after the wells are no longer economic to operate, and because they're paid out of operating cash flows, AROs pose a unique and substantial risk to landowners and taxpayers that requires foresight, planning, and a little bit of courage to deal with effectively at this point.
And so one common metaphor for property rights is that it is a bundle of sticks. And not literally a bundle of sticks, but figuratively a bundle of sticks, where owning something like land grants you a collection of privileges. So this, if you own land, you have several rights. You might have the right to farm, and the right to mine, the right to hunt, the right to build. Okay, you can fill in the blank what else you think this might be included here. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can exercise all of these rights at once. Okay, there may be trade-offs between different uses. And so, for example, if you want to use your land for oil development, it may be difficult. It may even be impossible for you to farm at the same time that you're exploiting the land for oil development. You might not be able to irrigate and sell water to the oil company. So it's a question of which one of those uses, which one of those sticks is relatively more valuable. Or in the case of water, how should I use the water stick? What's the relevant trade-off for me? Okay, so if you expect me to tell you the price of a pore space lease, I think you're going to be disappointed. But I do want to try to think about what the property right contours of pore space look like. So what are you leasing? Yeah, okay, we're leasing the space between the rocks underground. Okay, but what else do they need in order to be able to exploit that? Is this a non-renewable or renewable resource? Look, if we do pore space right, if we do geological sequestration right, this is a one-shot deal. Okay, we put the carbon dioxide down there and it stays, and then you fill it up and you walk away. Okay, but how long does that take? And what are the liability implications in, say, the short run and the medium run and the long run? What happens if the carbon dioxide doesn't stay down there? Do I have to pay back the money I get? Or does my counterparty have to pay back the money they got? And what implication is that going to have for the facility going forward? Okay, I mean, we're talking about something for a very, very long time. If you think about the sort of climate change carbon balance thing, we're talking about permanent. I think that was the term Professor Rigetti used this morning, right? This is a perpetuity, which is a scary big word if you're a lawyer. So should we have one upfront payment like we do for the pipeline? Or should we just get a series of term payments every time we're sure that the carbon dioxide is still down there? Like maybe, I don't know, once every millennium, we'll check in, give you a term payment. Okay? That doesn't sound very good. I mean, I might be here for the first one, but I'm probably not going to make it to the second millennium payment. But I think it's a legitimate question that you should think about. How long do you actually expect this stuff to be down there? How are you going to be using my pore space property over the short and the medium and the long run? I did some work several years ago about voluntary carbon offsets. These were mostly biological carbon sequestration. And those markets have had a heck of a time developing. I think we know more now globally about how to make those markets work, and I think that will be transmitted into the geological sequestration market. What I'm not as sure of is that it's going to be transmitted through that geological sequestration market to the landowner, to the pore space owner. I'm hopeful that it will work. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work out, but again, come back to the 5 elements that we talked about. We need to be able to define it, we need to be able to defend it, we need to make sure that somebody else isn't going to take my pore space by injecting CO2 next door. Okay? Need to be able to sell my pore space and say, hey, this is already full, or it's not full, you could use it again for pore space in the future. And then I need to think about the liability. And I think that those 5 things are actually a useful way for the pore space owner today to think about And coming to talk to friends or other associates at a place like this, come to talk to industry folks and try to understand how they're thinking about it. You might even talk to attorneys or other people who can give you other perspectives on this before you jump into it would go key.
What can you do? Throughout all of this, willful destruction of your property is a criminal offense in North Dakota. It always has been. And when the state of North Dakota and the oil companies spidered those pits out into your land, that was a criminal act. Anyone involved knew that your land was going to be destroyed by that act. Why did that pit have a membrane on it? You know, for years they were just leach pits, but then for 15 years or so they had a membrane on them. But then the evaporation rate wasn't good enough when they wanted to get rid of the pits, so they dug trenches out into the land, and then they filled the pit with dirt to push all those toxins out into your land, and then they walked away. Now what happens out on the landscape with this salt is it doesn't go down very fast, very far, because the saturated area, most of North Dakota, is these shrinking, swelling clays. And so much like a sewage lagoon, the clay kind of seals. It's not perfect, but downward movement is pretty slow. But when you get up to the area where sometimes it's wet and sometimes it's dry, it moves a lot faster. And this is where you can get salts moving across the landscape. Half mile's not unreasonable, and I'm sure if we checked everything, there'd be some places it's gone 2 or 3 miles. And so this is the problem. It's so big, what do we do? But your local district attorney is responsible when someone knowingly destroys your land to criminally charge them. And this won't stop until some of these guys are criminally charged. You know, you take Blacktail Creek up there, leaking pipeline that the company knew was leaking. And they continued using the pipeline for months. And finally, yeah, they have to pay for a cleanup. Who's sitting in jail for making that decision? No one. They negotiated. They walked away. Now, if I went down to the city park here in Bismarck with a spray can and sprayed the side of the toilet with something, I'd probably be sitting in jail. And you can still use the toilet just fine. So the law doesn't seem to be very fairly used to everybody. You've got this thing. Trespassing, many of these sites, they lease the pad, but if you look, they might be using it outside the pad for storage, for other things. Well, they didn't pay for that. They're trespassing. Kick them off there. Have your sheriff kick them off. And then ultimately, federally, there's racketeering charges. State racketeering probably wouldn't work, but I think in some of these cases the federal would. But it's going to be very difficult without someone whistleblowing. Now, easements. You know, we talked some today already about easements. And really, I tried to limit the time, because you know, outside in western North Dakota now, there's easements all over the place. And many of them don't have any pipe associated with them. And that easement is more difficult. It's actually stopping development in western North Dakota, because the easement guy controls whether another pipeline can come through his easement. And if an easement is ever used, I thought 30, 40 years, or maybe something like we try to reunite the minerals with the surface owner, maybe something like that would work. But it just died. The Garrison Diversion has easements that they've held on for 70 years, and they have no intention of letting them go, and they've never used them. And so that's a problem, but it keeps going on more and more.
On that, but for a landowner who's looking at what could be, whether it's dewatering from a pad or maybe it looks like it could be a pipeline spill, but specifically with produced water, are there constituents or chemicals where if someone says, oh, that's not a spill, that's just a natural saline seep? Are there chemical constituents you can look at to say, well, we know that's a produced water spill because it has this in it, for example?
Certainly, great question. So what identifies a produce water spill different from just natural saline seeps that we may see out in our areas? One of the first things we're going to look at, most of our saline areas are sodium sulfate, whereas the produce water is predominantly sodium chloride. There's other salt minerals in there, so that's going to be one of the first things. But we do have some areas that can have high chlorides as well, particularly from that northwest part of the state. The other indicator that we're going to look at to show produce water is bromide. So the bromide concentration, that indicates old water that was coming from deep underground from millions of years ago, and not surface water or water that's just been soaked into the soil. So those are probably the top ones. Then you can also start to look at just the ratio between the different constituents of, if you do compare water sources, if you have, say, a slough and questionable potential impact of water and the produce water, you can look at the different ratios between those. So those are the most common ones. Usually the bromide is the one that's most indicative.
Carl, are you saying that the slough is the baseline then that you'd use?
Yeah, the slough can be the baseline if we're comfortable that this is non-impacted.
Okay. Are there any new methods being used to remediate saltwater spills, and if so, are they being used in the field?
I'll try to answer it the best I can anyway. So we did, I know that EERC funded a project with Jonathan Ellingson with a Terracon. Terracon? Is that correct? Yeah. Terracon. And so that was one method where they, because part of the question before about putting the little bit of topsoil on top of contaminated, and that after a period of time it became more contaminated again. Well, part of that was breaking the capillary fringe. So basically, if you take this sponge that I was going to use in case you were asking me all these water quality questions, if you put this in water, you'll notice that the waters will rise up into the sponge. And that's what happens in the soil when you have groundwater. The water moves up. And it'll move up as far as the pores will allow. This is soil pores, not down in the Broom Creek formation. And so the salts always move with the water. Salts are soluble in water, so they're going to move with the water. And so to understand how to manage salts, you have to understand how to manage and understand how water moves in soil. And so what Jonathan's group did was they dug out the contaminated area. They figured out where it was, and then they dug it out. They put a capillary barrier. So basically they put something underneath the sponge so the water wouldn't come up through that. And so then they were allowed to, then they were able to put that soil or new soil back on top, and they were able to start growing plants and crops at that point. So one of the things that is one thing that's been shown, our state has provided funds for, and we have other projects where we're looking at making our own soils, so a Technosol soil that would be used in replacement of topsoil that's been contaminated. Part of this, so it's not new to the reclamation field. They do it a lot in hard rock mining, like gold and so forth. But one of the things we know is that you have, and it was brought up before, is that topsoil is sort of limited, right? I mean, soils develop with climate, and if you don't have a lot of rainfall, you don't get a lot of plants produced, you don't get a lot of soil organic carbon, you don't get a lot of soil development. Over time, things do move, and so I would say that even with good construction practices, which those are licensed contractors, I would say that water, salts, they do move through clay liners. I don't think that's a myth. I think that's fact. It just depends on what's the allowable movement per day and how that is regulated. So,
now how about the lateral to regular soil? Aren't we at risk of having lateral movement of sodium chloride into an area of clean soil? Aren't we evidence for that.
So the question revolves around how does water really move in soil? And water moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if you put a drop of water on your tablecloth, it will move laterally out. And it will move from that high concentration of water to where then it becomes in equilibrium with its environment. And so if there's salt in that droplet, it will move laterally just the same. And so unless there's an impermeable barrier that was put around a brine spill, if it's left to its ages, that salt will migrate laterally.
Let's see. So here's how the process works. I'm going to just pull these all up. Okay. So first we get the application, the big gold box. A company completes, they have completed their application, they've read the law, they've decided, looked at what needs to be addressed, they present us with an application. It includes a proposed route, if it's a pipeline or a transmission, electric transmission line, or a location for whatever facility. Our staff reviews it. That first step, our staff goes through it, makes sure that they have included everything that we need to review that application. Sometimes they submit the applications, they aren't complete. So then there's a back and forth with us and the company to make sure the application is complete. Once we deem it complete, then really we send out a notice that we're going to have a public hearing, and we publish those notices the law requires us to publish the notice in all of the county papers, the main county paper, and every county that's impacted by the project. So we do that, and then those are in those awful legal notices that not a lot of people read. But we also send out a news release at this point in all of the locations that we think folks might live and might be interested in this. And we have send out those news releases to try to get some additional media coverage on these issues. And so people know about it, hopefully, that we're having a public hearing. Then we have our public hearing. At the public hearing, it's an evidentiary hearing, which for anybody who isn't a lawyer, that means that we base our decision on the evidence that's in the record, and that includes everything that the company files, everything that anybody who intervenes formally with the project on the application files, and anybody who comes to our hearing and provides testimony. That's part of the official record, and we cannot make a decision on anything that's outside of that record. So if you talk to me about a project that you've got in your area after this meeting, I can't use that information in making a decision about that project. You have to get that information out in the public and into the official record. And it's really easy to do. You just come to our hearings, and since COVID hit, we've taken an extra step and have processes in place to be able to have all of our hearings available so you can watch them online and participate virtually. So it's not like seamless, it isn't like an interactive on your computer, but you can call into our office, we'll call you back, we'll get you on the phone in the hearing, and you can tell us what you want to tell us. And that counts as being part of the official record. So
gas storage is not a new thing. We've been storing gas across the country and the world for over a century. The initial gas storage really was done to help address seasonal demands for heating. So they'd store the gas and you'd have it available for the winter months when you really needed it. More and more, again, gas storage is being looked at for hydrogen storage, petrochemical development, and also we've seen an increase in the number of gas-fired power generation facilities, so those require gas storage as well. However, there's different types of gas storage containers, and I'll show those to you in just a minute. The one thing you need for petrochemical development, really it's preferable to have that gas or natural gas liquid stored in a salt cavern. And I'll explain why here. So here are some of your common gas storage targets. So salt caverns, which are engineered or developed, and I'll talk about those in just a sec. You also have depleted saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So the nice thing about a depleted oil and gas reservoir, it has held fluids and gas for millions of years. So you can be assured that it's a good container, right? Those fluids and liquids had not seeped out So you have a reasonable idea starting off that it has the ability to contain those compounds. Aquifers, saline aquifers are often used, and those are many of the targets that we're looking at now for CO2 storage. Those work fine, especially if you have no intention of retrieving it. Because as you inject that gas, I mean, there's already fluid in those pore spaces. Typically, it's brine. In the case of these saline reservoirs, if it's an oil and gas reservoir, you'll have brine and hydrocarbons. But so you have brine that exists in that pore space already, and when you inject your gas, you have a front where that gas mixes with the fluids already in your reservoir. In that front, it's also called your gas cushion. You're not going to retrieve the gas from that. Really, it's just kind of wasted. It goes into developing your storage facility. And so in terms of like higher value products like natural gas liquids, hydrogen, the salt is nice because it's very competent. It's like an underground storage container. Salt has the ability to flow. It can be plastic, especially at higher temperatures and pressures. And so it's self-sealing. So if there's any little fractures or cracks in it, they tend to seal up. And so it makes a very nice storage containment, very nice storage container, and you can inject gas and retrieve it at relatively high rates. Whereas if you're trying to, I guess, recover gas that's been stored in a saline reservoir, it's going to take a lot longer to get it out. So.
And then I'll talk a little bit about our reclamation program. That just shows, that is a picture of a site before and then after reclamation. So I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's that same landscape. Okay, the reclamation program was developed due to the increase in the number of rights-of-way issued and a limited amount of staff to monitor the process. The program allows right-of-way holders, department field inspectors, and department personnel to report and monitor the condition of the right-of-way during the multi-year process. The web-based program allows better communication on the status of the reclamation on an encumbrance. Inspectors should have basic knowledge of plants, soils, and ecology. They need to be able to ID certain grasses and weed species. Inspections should and are conducted at least annually, starting immediately after the right-of-way has been constructed. And most reclamation projects take a minimum of 3 years. The program allows reports to be completed using a computer, tablet, or a smartphone, and they need to have access to the internet. And reports are editable up to 7 days after submission. And this just shows our inspection form, and some of the things on there that people should be cognizant of. What our inspectors look for are whether they follow, if they followed the survey plot, and so they're looking to make sure that it was placed. They're looking for proper placement. Whether the area had a fence to exclude so that it can recover quicker. Then they're looking at the vegetation, they're looking at weed and pest, erosion, and they're also looking for any waste or contamination.